By the spring of 1942, the Pacific War was still young, but it was already changing faster than anyone had anticipated. Just months after Pearl Harbor, Japan's rapid expansion had reshaped the strategic map of the Pacific. Island after island had fallen. Allied forces were pushed back, reeling from a series of defeats that suggested Japanese naval power was both dominant and unstoppable. Yet beneath this momentum, a quiet transformation was underway, one that would soon redefine how wars at sea were fought. For decades, naval warfare had been built around a single assumption: battleships decided wars. Massive guns, thick armor, and direct confrontation were considered the ultimate measures of naval strength. But the early months of the Pacific War had already begun to challenge this belief. Aircraft carriers, once viewed as support vessels, were emerging as the true centers of power. They could strike far beyond the horizon, turning distance into a weapon. Still, no one had yet seen what would happen when carriers faced each other directly. That moment was approaching in the Coral Sea. Strategically, the region mattered enormously. Control of the Coral Sea would determine whether Japan could threaten Australia, isolate it from the United States, and consolidate its dominance in the South Pacific. For Japanese planners, the next step seemed logical and achievable: capture Port Moresby in New Guinea and extend their defensive perimeter even further. If successful, it would place Japan in a position of unprecedented strategic advantage. The Allies understood the danger. For the first time since the war began, American naval commanders were no longer reacting blindly to Japanese moves. Intelligence, code-breaking, and reconnaissance were beginning to provide fragments of insight into enemy intentions. These pieces were incomplete, uncertain, and risky to act upon, but they offered something the Allies had previously lacked: a chance to intercept rather than respond. As carrier task forces maneuvered across thousands of miles of open ocean, neither side could see the other. There would be no line of battleships exchanging fire, no direct clash of fleets. Instead, the coming battle would be decided by aircraft launched from ships that never came within visual range. Pilots, navigators, and intelligence officers would carry the burden of victory or defeat. The Battle of the Coral Sea would become something entirely new in the history of warfare. It was not just another engagement in the Pacific War. It was the first true carrier duel, a battle where fleets fought without ever meeting, and where the future of naval warfare would be decided not by guns, but by aircraft, information, and timing. In early 1942, Japanese naval planners believed they were close to achieving strategic dominance in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had crippled American battleships. Southeast Asia had fallen with stunning speed. The Dutch East Indies were secured, providing access to vital oil resources. From Tokyo's perspective, momentum was firmly on Japan's side. The next objective was not simply territorial expansion, but strategic isolation. Australia stood at the center of this calculation. Although Australia had not been invaded, its importance was clear to both sides. It served as a critical base for Allied operations, a hub for reinforcements, supplies, and air power flowing from the United States into the Pacific. As long as Australia remained connected to America, Japan faced the prospect of a prolonged war against an enemy with overwhelming industrial capacity. Cutting that connection became a priority. Japanese planners devised a bold operation. By capturing Port Moresby in New Guinea, Japan could threaten northern Australia directly and sever Allied supply routes across the Coral Sea. Control of this region would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and place immense pressure on Allied forces throughout the South Pacific. It was not an invasion of Australia, but it was the next best thing. The plan relied heavily on naval aviation. Carrier groups would provide air cover for invasion forces, neutralize Allied ships, and prevent interference from American task forces. Japanese commanders remained confident in their carrier pilots, many of whom were veterans of Pearl Harbor and earlier campaigns. Their experience, coordination, and discipline were widely regarded as unmatched. Yet confidence carried risk. Japan's expanding empire demanded protection across enormous distances. Carrier strength, though formidable, was finite. Losses could not be replaced easily. Every operation required precise timing and flawless execution. Still, Japanese leadership believed that aggressive action would keep the Allies off balance and prevent them from regaining the initiative. Unbeknownst to Japanese planners, their intentions were no longer completely hidden. Allied intelligence had begun to piece together fragments of Japanese communications. While the full picture remained unclear, American commanders sensed that something significant was coming in the Coral Sea. For the first time, the Allies were not merely reacting to Japanese advances. They were preparing to challenge them. As invasion convoys assembled and carrier groups moved into position, the stage was set. What Japan intended as another step in its unstoppable advance would soon become a test of an entirely new form of naval warfare, and a confrontation that neither side fully understood. By the spring of 1942, the Allies were still fighting from a position of weakness. The Pacific Fleet was rebuilding after Pearl Harbor, and every operational aircraft carrier represented a critical asset that could not be easily replaced. Losses were felt immediately. Yet despite this vulnerability, American commanders made a decision that would shape the coming battle. They chose to confront Japan in the Coral Sea rather than withdraw and wait. This decision was driven by intelligence and by necessity. American codebreakers had begun to achieve limited success against Japanese naval communications. The information they gathered was incomplete and often ambiguous, but it pointed toward a major operation aimed at Port Moresby. The stakes were clear. If Japan succeeded, Australia's security would be gravely threatened, and Allied strategy in the South Pacific would be severely compromised. Doing nothing was no longer an option. Admiral Chester Nimitz authorized a bold response. 2 American carrier task forces were assembled and sent toward the Coral Sea. Their mission was not to seek a traditional fleet engagement, but to disrupt the invasion and challenge Japanese carrier superiority. It was a calculated gamble. The Americans knew they were outmatched in experience and that a major defeat could leave the Pacific dangerously exposed. Unlike earlier engagements, neither side expected to fight at close range. The ocean itself became a battlefield of uncertainty. Reconnaissance aircraft searched vast expanses of water, often returning with nothing. Weather, distance, and misidentification added layers of confusion. Decisions were made based on partial information, with no guarantee that enemy forces were where they were believed to be. For American pilots and crews, the pressure was immense. Many had little combat experience. Carrier operations were demanding even in peacetime, and now they were being conducted under the constant threat of sudden air attack. Every launch and recovery carried risk. Every report from a scout plane could mean the difference between surprise and disaster. The Allies entered the Coral Sea knowing they might lose ships, aircraft, and men they could scarcely afford to spare. but they also understood something critical. Stopping Japan now, even at great cost, could alter the course of the war. As carrier task forces closed in from opposite directions, the coming battle promised no clear victor, only a test of nerve, intelligence, and a new way of fighting at sea. As the opposing forces moved into the Coral Sea in early May 1942, the coming battle took on a strange and unprecedented character. Unlike the great naval engagements of the past, there would be no dramatic moment when fleets sighted each other on the horizon. No exchange of heavy gunfire. No line of battleships advancing toward contact. Instead, two powerful carrier forces maneuvered blindly across vast stretches of ocean, separated by hundreds of miles and connected only by aircraft and radio reports. This invisibility defined everything. Commanders on both sides relied on reconnaissance planes to locate the enemy. Scout aircraft were launched at dawn, flying long, exhausting missions over open water, scanning for the faint silhouettes of ships far below. Many returned without sighting anything. Others reported contacts that later proved false. Clouds, weather fronts, and the curvature of the earth all conspired to hide fleets from one another. Information was fragmentary, delayed, and often wrong. The result was a battle fought through guesswork and urgency. Decisions had to be made quickly, sometimes based on a single uncertain report. Launch too early, and aircraft might miss their targets or run out of fuel. Launch too late, and the enemy might strike first. Every choice carried risk, and there was little room for correction once planes were airborne. For the pilots, the experience was unlike anything before. They were sent out across empty ocean with limited navigation aids, trusting that the enemy would be where intelligence suggested. Many never found their targets. Others stumbled upon enemy ships unexpectedly, forced to attack with whatever weapons they carried and whatever coordination they could manage. Courage mattered, but so did chance. This new form of combat stripped away traditional ideas of control. Admirals could no longer see the battlefield. They fought through reports, maps, and time delays. Victory depended not on direct command, but on how well systems worked together: reconnaissance, communication, coordination, and timing. The Battle of the Coral Sea was becoming a duel fought at extreme distance, where the enemy was always present yet rarely visible. It was a preview of the future of naval warfare, and neither side fully understood just how revolutionary this moment was. As the search intensified and tension mounted, the first real blows of the battle were about to fall, not between ships, but from the sky. On May 7, 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea erupted into violence, not with the clash of fleets, but with aircraft plunging out of the sky. After days of searching and uncertainty, both sides believed they had finally located the enemy. What followed was a series of attacks shaped as much by confusion as by precision, revealing both the power and the limitations of carrier warfare. Early that morning, American reconnaissance aircraft reported what appeared to be Japanese carriers. Acting quickly, U.S. commanders ordered a full strike. Waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes lifted off their decks and raced toward the reported position. For the pilots, there was no turning back. Fuel calculations were tight, navigation uncertain, and radio silence often enforced. The ocean below offered no reference points, only endless blue. When American aircraft reached their target, they discovered something unexpected. Instead of fleet carriers, They found a smaller Japanese force covering the invasion effort, a light carrier and escort ships. Despite the mistake, the attack went forward. Bombs and torpedoes struck with devastating effect, sinking the light carrier Shoho. The loss was swift and total. Within minutes, one of Japan's carriers was gone, destroyed without ever seeing the enemy that had killed it. The sinking of Shoho marked a historic moment. It was one of the first times in naval history that a major warship had been destroyed solely by aircraft launched from distant carriers. The message was unmistakable. The era of gun-dominated sea battles was fading, replaced by air power as the decisive force. Yet the battle was far from settled. Japanese commanders, unaware of the full scope of American movements, prepared their own counterstrikes. Their reconnaissance had also produced incomplete information, and both sides now operated under false assumptions about the enemy's strength and location. The Coral Sea became a battlefield defined by uncertainty, where success depended on speed, timing, and luck, as much as skill. As the first day ended, both sides claimed victories, and both sides were wrong about what they had truly accomplished. The real carrier forces were still intact, maneuvering just beyond reach. The most decisive clashes were yet to come. What had begun was not a single engagement, but a deadly exchange of blows from the sky, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test the limits of this new form of warfare. On May 8, 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea reached its decisive moment. For the first time in history, two opposing carrier forces located each other and prepared for simultaneous strikes. Both sides now understood that the battle would be decided not by maneuver or endurance, but by which air groups could strike first and strike effectively. Speed, coordination, and luck would determine survival. At dawn, reconnaissance aircraft finally confirmed the presence of enemy fleet carriers on both sides. Almost immediately, flight decks came alive. Aircraft were fueled, armed, and launched in rapid succession. There was no time for hesitation. Each commander knew that if the enemy's planes arrived first, his carriers might not survive long enough to launch a counterstrike. American and Japanese strike groups passed each other in midair, unaware that they were flying directly toward mutual destruction. This eerie crossing symbolized the strange nature of the battle, two fleets fighting a deadly duel without ever seeing one another. Pilots focused on navigation and fuel, knowing that failure to find their target could mean a forced landing in the open sea. Japanese aircraft reached the American carriers first. Dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked with precision, pushing through anti-aircraft fire and fighter defenses. The carrier USS Lexington was hit multiple times. Fires broke out, and damage control teams fought desperately to contain the damage. For a time, it appeared that the ship might survive. Then, secondary explosions tore through the vessel, sealing its fate. By the end of the day, Lexington had to be abandoned and sunk by her own escort. American aircraft, meanwhile, struck back. They located and attacked the Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku, scoring several direct hits. The damage was severe. Her flight deck was wrecked, aircraft destroyed, and operations halted. Although Shokaku was not sunk, she was effectively removed from combat. Her sister carrier Zuikaku escaped physical damage, but lost so many aircraft and experienced pilots that she too could no longer operate effectively. The exchange was brutal and costly on both sides. Aircraft losses were heavy. Experienced pilots were killed or lost at sea. The Coral Sea had proven that carrier warfare was unforgiving. Victory could come at a price nearly as high as defeat. By nightfall, the battle had exhausted both fleets. Neither side had achieved a clear tactical victory, yet something profound had occurred. For the first time, a Japanese offensive had been stopped by Allied naval power. The age of uncontested Japanese expansion was over, even if the final outcome was not yet clear. When the fighting in the Coral Sea subsided, neither side could immediately claim a clear victory. Ships were damaged or lost, aircraft destroyed, and pilots missing. Both fleets withdrew to regroup, assess losses, and repair what they could. On paper, the outcome appeared inconclusive. The Japanese had sunk an American fleet carrier. The Americans had damaged a Japanese carrier and destroyed a smaller one. Yet the true meaning of the battle lay beyond the raw numbers. Tactically, Japan could point to the sinking of USS Lexington as a success. It was a heavy blow to a U.S. Navy still recovering from Pearl Harbor. American commanders felt the loss acutely, knowing how few carriers they had available in the Pacific. From a purely numerical standpoint, Japan appeared to have inflicted greater damage. Strategically, however, the picture was very different. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby had been halted. For the first time since the war began, a major Japanese offensive had failed. The carefully planned operation to extend Japan's defensive perimeter and isolate Australia had been stopped not by land forces, but by naval air power. This alone marked a turning point. Equally important were the hidden costs to Japan. The damaged carrier Shokaku required extensive repairs, and Zuikaku, though physically intact, had lost so many aircraft and trained pilots that she was combat ineffective. Japan's carrier strength, once concentrated and formidable, had been weakened at a moment when it mattered most. These losses could not be easily replaced. For the Allies, the battle offered something they had not yet possessed: confidence. Coral Sea proved that Japanese carriers could be found, hit, and stopped. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility was cracking. Allied commanders began to understand that intelligence, coordination, and air power could offset Japan's early advantages in experience and training. The Battle of the Coral Sea ended without a dramatic surrender or decisive destruction of a fleet, but it reshaped the strategic balance in the Pacific. It showed that the Japanese advance was not unstoppable, and that the future of the war would be decided not by who struck hardest in a single battle, but by who could sustain losses and adapt to a new kind of warfare. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Pacific War entered a new and critical phase. Although the battle itself had ended without a decisive tactical victory, its consequences rippled far beyond the waters where it was fought. For both Japan and the United States, Coral Sea reshaped expectations, priorities, and strategic planning in ways that would soon collide again, this time on an even larger scale. For Japan, the outcome was deeply unsettling. The failure to capture Port Moresby represented more than a missed objective. It exposed the limits of Japanese expansion. Until Coral Sea, Japanese operations had moved forward with near constant success. Now, an operation had been stopped not by overwhelming force, but by interception and resistance. The psychological impact within the Japanese naval command was significant, even if it was not openly acknowledged. More damaging were the material consequences. Two of Japan's frontline carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were effectively removed from immediate operations. One required major repairs. The other lacked trained air crews. Together, they would be absent from Japan's next major offensive. This absence would soon prove critical, though Japanese planners did not yet fully grasp how costly it would be. American commanders, meanwhile, drew valuable lessons from the battle. Coral Sea confirmed that intelligence and early warning could change the balance of power. It also revealed weaknesses, coordination problems, aircraft losses, and the vulnerability of carriers under attack. These lessons were studied urgently. There was little time to rest or recover. Another confrontation was already looming. Japanese leadership pressed forward with a new plan. Determined to regain the initiative and deliver a decisive blow, they focused on a remote atoll in the Central Pacific, Midway. The objective was clear: to draw out and destroy the remaining American carriers in a single, decisive engagement. Coral Sea had shaken confidence, but it had not ended ambition. What neither side fully realized was how closely these two battles were linked. Coral Sea had altered the balance of forces, thinned Japan's carrier strength, and hardened American resolve. The lessons learned, the losses suffered, and the strategic shifts that followed would all converge at Midway. In this sense, the Battle of the Coral Sea was not an endpoint, but a bridge. It marked the moment when carrier warfare moved from experiment to expectation, and when the Pacific War accelerated toward a confrontation that would change its course forever. The Battle of the Coral Sea forced both sides to confront uncomfortable truths about modern naval warfare. For decades, fleets had been built around battleships, massive symbols of power designed for direct confrontation. Coral Sea proved that this era was over. Control of the sea would now be decided by aircraft, intelligence, and timing, often at distances where opposing fleets never saw one another. For American commanders, the battle was a harsh but invaluable education. The loss of USS Lexington demonstrated how vulnerable even the most powerful carriers could be when aviation fuel, munitions, and damage control systems were overwhelmed. Pilots learned the consequences of poor coordination and incomplete intelligence. Torpedo squadrons suffered heavy losses, exposing weaknesses in tactics and equipment that would demand immediate correction. At the same time, Coral Sea confirmed that the United States could stand against Japan's elite naval aviation. Japanese pilots were still highly skilled, but they were no longer untouchable. American air crews, many of them inexperienced, had fought with determination and adaptability. The psychological balance began to shift. Japan could be challenged and stopped. For Japan, the lessons were more troubling. The battle revealed that even flawless planning could be undone by interception and resistance. Japanese carrier doctrine had relied on striking first and decisively. At Coral Sea, that advantage was contested. Losses among experienced air crews were particularly alarming. Unlike the United States, Japan lacked the industrial and training capacity to replace pilots quickly. Every loss carried long-term consequences. Damage assessments told a sobering story. Aircraft production struggled to keep pace. Fuel shortages limited training. Carriers required maintenance that could not be rushed. The margin for error was shrinking, even as Japanese strategy demanded greater risk. Both navies emerged from Coral Sea changed. The battle had not decided the war, but it had clarified its nature. Victory would depend on logistics, intelligence, and the ability to learn faster than the enemy. Adaptation, not tradition, would determine survival. In the quiet weeks that followed, ships were repaired, squadrons reorganized, and doctrines revised. Beneath the surface calm, both sides prepared for what they sensed was coming next. Coral Sea had stripped away illusions. The Pacific War was becoming a contest not just of strength, but of learning. And the next battle would punish whoever failed to do so. When the Battle of the Coral Sea ended, neither side could claim a traditional victory. No enemy battleships had been sunk in a dramatic surface engagement. No fleet had been annihilated. And yet, the strategic consequences of the battle reached far beyond the immediate losses recorded on paper. Coral Sea became one of the rare moments in military history where perception mattered as much as destruction. Tactically, Japan appeared to have the advantage. The United States lost the aircraft carrier USS Lexington, one of its most powerful warships, and USS Yorktown suffered significant damage. Japanese losses, while serious, seemed lighter by comparison. On the surface, this suggested another Japanese success in a war that had already seen rapid expansion and repeated Allied setbacks. Strategically, however, the outcome told a very different story. Japan's objective had not been to trade ships, it had been to clear the path for the invasion of Port Moresby. That objective failed. For the first time in the Pacific War, a major Japanese offensive had been stopped. Australia remained secure from direct invasion, and the strategic balance in the South Pacific shifted. This distinction between tactical results and strategic impact was crucial. Japanese planners had assumed that Allied resistance could be brushed aside with decisive blows. Coral Sea demonstrated that this assumption was no longer valid. The United States Navy had absorbed losses and still held the line. Japan had encountered a limit to its momentum. For the Allies, the battle delivered something equally important: confidence. Coral Sea proved that Japan's carrier forces were not invincible. American commanders learned that they could disrupt Japanese plans even without perfect execution. The psychological effect rippled through naval leadership. The war was no longer about survival, it was becoming a contest for initiative. At the same time, both sides faced a sobering reality. Carrier warfare was extraordinarily expensive. Every battle consumed aircraft, pilots, fuel, and time, resources that could not be replaced equally by both nations. Beneath the surface of strategic calculations, an imbalance was growing. Coral Sea ended without a clear winner, but it ended something else just as important: the era of unchecked Japanese expansion. From this point forward, Japan would no longer dictate the course of the Pacific War alone. The struggle for control had begun, and the next encounter would decide far more than a single invasion plan. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Battle of the Coral Sea was what never happened. At no point during the engagement did the main surface fleets of either side come within visual range of one another. There were no exchanges of naval gunfire, no lines of battleships trading broadsides. Instead, the battle unfolded entirely through aircraft, radio transmissions, and fragments of intelligence, marking a fundamental break from centuries of naval tradition. For commanders on both sides, this created unprecedented challenges. Decisions had to be made based on incomplete information, delayed reports, and assumptions that could be dangerously wrong. A sighting error, a misinterpreted radio message, or a delayed launch could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. The ocean itself became an enemy, concealing fleets and magnifying uncertainty. Pilots bore the greatest burden of this new form of warfare. They flew hundreds of miles over open water, often at the limits of their fuel range, searching for targets that might already have moved or vanished. Many never found the enemy. Others found themselves attacking the wrong ships, misidentifying carriers, or striking already damaged vessels while more valuable targets escaped. This fog of war defined Coral Sea. Japanese strike groups sometimes returned believing they had destroyed American carriers that were still afloat. American pilots reported contacts that could not be confirmed in time to exploit them. Both sides operated in a haze of uncertainty that tested command structures and decision-making at every level. Yet this invisibility was not a weakness. It was the defining characteristic of modern naval warfare. Coral Sea demonstrated that future battles would be fought not by who had the largest guns, but by who could gather information, interpret it quickly, and act decisively under uncertainty. The implications were profound. Intelligence, reconnaissance, and communications became as vital as armor and firepower. Navies would rise or fall based on their ability to see the enemy before being seen themselves. In this sense, the Battle of the Coral Sea was more than a clash of fleets. It was a preview of the future. A war fought across empty oceans, decided by aircraft launched from unseen carriers, guided by imperfect knowledge, and won by those who could master chaos faster than their enemy. Behind the maps, carrier movements, and strategic calculations of the Battle of the Coral Sea lay a quieter reality, the human cost paid by those who fought it. Carrier warfare demanded extraordinary endurance from pilots, deck crews, and sailors, often under conditions of extreme stress, uncertainty, and fatigue. Coral Sea was not only a test of doctrine, it was a test of people. Pilots faced some of the most dangerous missions of the war. Long-range strikes meant hours in cramped cockpits, scanning endless ocean for a fleeting silhouette of enemy ships. Fuel margins were razor-thin. Many pilots returned with tanks nearly empty, landing in darkness or ditching at sea when they could not find their carriers. For those who went down, rescue was uncertain and often impossible. The ocean offered no mercy. On the flight decks, crews worked relentlessly. Aircraft were refueled, rearmed, repaired, and relaunched under constant threat of attack. Fires, explosions, and fuel spills were ever-present dangers. When strikes hit home, damage control teams fought desperately to contain flames and flooding, knowing that a single failure could doom an entire ship, as it did aboard USS Lexington. Sailors below deck experienced the battle differently. They felt the shock of explosions through steel bulkheads, breathed smoke-filled air, and waited in darkness as damage reports echoed through the ship. Many had little understanding of the larger battle unfolding around them. Their world narrowed to survival, discipline, and obedience. Japanese crews endured similar hardships. Despite their training and experience, they faced the same uncertainties, losses, and exhaustion. Each aircraft lost meant not just a machine destroyed, but a highly trained pilot who could not easily be replaced. The emotional toll mounted quietly, hidden behind official reports and optimistic language. Coral Sea revealed that modern naval warfare demanded more than courage. It demanded resilience under constant strain. There were no moments of relief, no clear front lines, and no certainty of victory. For those who fought it, the battle was not a single event, but a continuous state of tension stretching across days and nights. This human dimension often disappeared in strategic summaries, but it shaped the war's outcome as surely as any plan or weapon. The Pacific War would continue to demand this level of sacrifice, and Coral Sea was only the beginning. When the smoke cleared over the Coral Sea, both navies began an urgent process of analysis. The battle had exposed strengths, weaknesses, and dangerous assumptions on both sides. More importantly, it provided lessons that would shape the very next carrier clash. One, that would decide the direction of the Pacific War. For the United States Navy, Coral Sea was a harsh but invaluable education. Commanders recognized critical flaws in coordination between scouting aircraft, strike groups, and fleet defenses. Communication delays and fragmented intelligence had cost precious time and lives. At the same time, American pilots demonstrated determination and adaptability, attacking under difficult conditions and pressing assaults, even when success seemed unlikely. One lesson stood above all others. Carriers were both extraordinarily powerful and dangerously vulnerable. Protecting them required layered air defense, improved radar usage, and faster decision-making. These insights would soon be applied, refined, and tested under even greater pressure. Japan also learned, but not all the right lessons. While Japanese pilots performed with skill and discipline, the battle exposed a hidden weakness: attrition. Losses suffered at Coral Sea, especially among experienced air crews, were far more damaging than they appeared on paper. Japan's training system could not rapidly replace veteran pilots. Every loss mattered more than Japanese planners were willing to admit. Equally troubling was the realization that surprise could no longer be assumed. Allied intelligence and resistance were improving. Japanese operations, once executed against unprepared enemies, now faced opponents capable of anticipation and disruption. The margin for error was shrinking. Perhaps the most dangerous conclusion drawn by Japan was one of partial reassurance. Because the battle had not resulted in total defeat, some leaders believed their carrier force remained decisively superior. This illusion would soon prove catastrophic. Coral Sea thus became a transition point. It was the bridge between early war confidence and the brutal clarity that followed. Both sides left the battle changed, but only one would fully adapt to what it had learned. Within weeks, the lessons of Coral Sea would collide with fate at Midway. And there, the future of the Pacific War would be decided. The Battle of the Coral Sea occupies a unique place in the history of warfare, not because of its scale, but because of what it fundamentally changed. It was the first naval battle in which opposing fleets never saw each other, never exchanged gunfire, and never fought ship to ship. Instead, aircraft became the primary weapon, and distance became the defining factor. From this moment on, naval warfare would never be the same. Coral Sea shattered centuries of tradition built around battleships as the ultimate symbol of sea power. Massive guns, thick armor, and close-range engagements had defined naval dominance since the age of sail. In just a few days in May 1942, that doctrine was rendered obsolete. Power now rested with floating airfields and the ability to project force hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. Strategically, the battle proved that stopping an enemy could matter more than destroying them. Japan failed to achieve its objective, the capture of Port Moresby, and that failure altered the balance of power in the Pacific. Australia remained secure. Allied supply lines held. Japan's southern expansion was checked for the first time since the war began. This alone made Coral Sea a turning point, regardless of ship losses. Psychologically, the impact was just as significant. For Japan, the battle introduced doubt. Victory was no longer automatic. Plans could fail. Losses could not always be absorbed. For the United States and its allies, Coral Sea delivered confidence. The enemy could be challenged, disrupted, and stopped. The Pacific War was no longer a series of retreats. It was becoming a contest. Coral Sea also accelerated innovation. Radar usage improved. Fighter coordination evolved. Damage control procedures were re-examined. Carrier doctrine matured at extraordinary speed, driven by the knowledge that the next battle could decide the fate of entire fleets. Most importantly, Coral Sea marked the beginning of a new rhythm in the Pacific War. Instead of sudden shock and rapid collapse, the conflict shifted toward a sequence of decisive carrier battles, each building on the lessons of the last. The war had entered its modern phase. Though often overshadowed by Midway, Coral Sea made Midway possible. It stopped Japan, taught both sides how carrier war would be fought, and set the stage for the clash that would follow. In doing so, it changed the course of the Pacific War and the future of naval combat itself. The Battle of the Coral Sea did not end the Pacific War, but it changed the rules by which that war would be fought. It marked the moment when naval power fully entered the age of air dominance, where steel hulls mattered less than flight decks, pilots, and information. From this point forward, control of the skies meant control of the seas. For the United States, Coral Sea was a proving ground. It revealed weaknesses, but it also confirmed potential. American industry, training systems, and command structures proved capable of learning and adapting at extraordinary speed. Losses were absorbed, lessons implemented, and confidence restored. The battle demonstrated that even without overwhelming strength, coordination, and resilience could halt an advancing empire. For Japan, Coral Sea was a warning that went only partially heeded. The carrier force remained powerful, but it was no longer untouchable. Attrition, especially among experienced pilots, had begun to erode Japan's greatest advantage. Yet the deeper implications were not fully understood. Confidence remained high, and faith in decisive battle persisted. This disconnect between reality and perception would soon have devastating consequences. Historically, Coral Sea stands as the first true carrier duel, a battle decided entirely by aircraft launched from ships that never came into direct contact. It previewed the future of warfare not only in the Pacific, but across the world. Modern naval combat, with its emphasis on air power, intelligence, and long-range strike, can trace its origins directly back to this confrontation. The battle also demonstrated that victory in modern war is not always measured by destruction alone. Japan lost fewer ships, but failed in its strategic goal. The Allies suffered visible losses, yet gained the initiative. Coral Sea proved that stopping an enemy at the right moment can matter more than defeating them outright. In the larger story of World War II, the Battle of the Coral Sea is often overshadowed by the dramatic triumph at Midway. But without Coral Sea, Midway might never have happened under the same conditions. It was the battle that slowed Japan, educated the Allies, and reshaped naval warfare forever. The Pacific War would continue with greater intensity, greater losses, and greater stakes. But after Coral Sea, one truth was undeniable. The age of the aircraft carrier had arrived, and the future of war at sea would be written not by guns, but by wings.